Welcome to Music Ed Tech Talk, a podcast exploring music, education, technology, and the intersections between them, with a special focus on the productive and creative process. I'm your host, Robby Burns. Thanks to my sponsor this week, Scale Exercise Play-Along Tracks. Hey, it's me, Robby, and I'm doing a solo episode today all about the tools I use to manage a private teaching studio. And this is a pretty interesting topic for me because this show and the blog contain my most public-facing output. What I don't think everyone knows who knows me is that my primary side gig, so to speak, the thing I spend the most of my professional time doing outside of teaching band in the public school system is actually teaching privately. I usually have typically between 20 and 30 private students. All of them, well, most of them are percussion students who are students in the district or in one of the neighboring districts where I live. And I've developed just a lot of philosophy and thoughts that I'm not planning on getting into because as I was planning this episode, I was quickly getting overwhelmed by how long or how many episodes I could fill talking about the subject of teaching privately. It hasn't gotten addressed as often on this show as public school because I have assumed that a big part of my audience is teaching in some kind of classroom where it's not one-to-one. But I also know that a lot of teachers, as a side thing, just like me, are teaching some amount of private students. And I think that the tools I'm going to talk about today will help you whether you have like 2 students or whether you have like your own business private teaching. In fact, we'll get into a little bit of that later because I am operating pretty much with a pretty high volume of students, but also I'm still kind of like only just considering some of the implications of what it might mean to organize myself more like a business. And I already kind of do from a philosophical standpoint, but I'm talking more specifically about some tools. Like there are a lot of really popular scheduling tools and financial tools online and that you can download that help in those cases. I'm curious if anyone is interested in me going down that direction with this, please write to me. I'd love to maybe think about doing other follow-ups to this episode. But for today, I'm going to be focusing on what has been the majority of my private teaching experience, which is largely just like me, by myself, existing, managing all communication and finance and organization and everything all by myself. So some of those, like if you're someone who's looking to like open up a studio and have like multiple employees, there are definitely some tools for that I'll only briefly touch today. But if you want more of that, let me know and I can cover some of that in a future topic. Before we get into all that, let's talk about some news and follow-up. I have some recent blog posts you might want to check out. I linked out to the Scoring Notes blog recently. David MacDonald covered a really cool music notation controller called the Odla, or I think it's Odla. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I will link that blog post here. It's really cool. It's kind of an interesting take on note input, keyboard, mouse, and piano keyboard. Like none of those kinds of ways that we typically input notes into a piece of music notation software represent the staff. So that's what this controller tries to do is the input is sort of like a sequence of buttons from high to low that are represented by lines and spaces. And then you have some buttons for changing the note duration. And it's sort of like intended to more intuitively match the visual of 5 lines and 4 spaces on the staff. I'll go read it if you're interested in this. I think that David MacDonald has a pretty good take on who this is for and who it's not for. I also did a post on my desk setup. I wrote this for MacStories.net. They have a club membership with a weekly newsletter and a bunch of other things, and their editors asked if I could. I was sharing about it in a community Discord with some pictures, and they asked if I would write about it, and I recently published that to my own blog where you can go read it and see pictures of all the stuff I keep on my desk. I think it's pretty practical, but it's also got some fun gadgets and things, stuff that I assume people like, stuff that I just kind of take for granted that's sitting here, but that I think people are interested in. I've got like a little bit about the Stream Deck and the Ableton Push and my computer hardware interface, microphone, headphones, all of that stuff. I also wrote about Soundsource 5.5, adding shortcut support. This actually happened a little while ago, but I only recently wrote about it. In fact, speaking of Mac Stories and Soundsource, I wrote another blog post you might want to check out about how I'm automating my tech setup in the band rehearsal. Beginning a rehearsal of, 50 to 80 middle schoolers is sometimes a little chaotic, and fiddling with my computers is not something I really like to do when I have students rushing into the classroom with questions and needs, and I need to be present. So what I've done is I've used the Shortcuts app on my iPad, iPhone, Apple Watch, and Mac to basically like string together a sequence of the things I always do on each of those devices at the beginning of class. So like running my presentation with the daily agenda on my Mac, playing some music as the students come in on my phone, while also opening my tuner app, opening my sheet music and my seating chart and my lesson plan on my iPad. All of that happens. I've actually got it down to 0 clicks and taps. Basically plugging in my laptop to the front of room setup does all of that. And I wrote this, I actually entered this shortcut into an automation contest that Mac Stories had, and it didn't win, but it was a really fun experiment to try to more formally put that together in a way that's a third party would understand. And I thought, hey, what if I'm entering this into an automation contest? It's a little nerdy, but there might be some of you who might want to go pick apart that shortcut, download it to your phone or your Mac, and see, maybe it'd be a good way if you've been thinking about doing some automation and some with shortcuts, it might be a good way for you to see how things are put together. It's actually a pretty easy shortcut. It's mostly just a bunch of very, very basic actions, but that I have just strung all of them together in one sequence. So it's pretty cool. I'll link that blog post to the session, to the show notes of this very episode. Oh, and I didn't mention why that has anything to do with Soundsource 5.5. Soundsource, the app by Rogue Amoeba, which is like it's kind of like if you're on the Mac, it replaces the sound. Like if you go to the menu bar, you can see the little speaker icon and you can like kind of choose like what your inputs and your outputs are. Well, Soundsource is like a hypercharged version of that adds like individual volume ins and outs of all of your running apps on your computer. You can like run third-party plugins through the output of an individual app. And now they have shortcut support as well. So you can like, when I plug in my computer at the front of the room, I always want it to output to the audio interface so that the music and the audio of my Mac comes through like the big speakers in the band room. So that usually happens by default when I plug in the computer to that setup, but sometimes it doesn't. So Soundsource can now automate the action of connecting to the correct audio output when I plug in my computer. So kind of fun. Really, really great app. I recommend it. If you have never heard of it, I'll link that as well. Okay, here we go. Private Studio Tech. So let's first of all just talk about like getting students. So if you're interested in private teaching, or if you've been doing it for a long time, you might be wondering like, what are some ways to have a steady flow of students who are interested in working with you? And what I have found is that it is always easier to teach students who are in the district where you live. And if you're a public school teacher, it's in particular much easier to find students in the district where you work. And just because of the relationships that I develop with the varying different band directors at the high school, elementary school, and middle school level in the area where I am, like because of those relationships, they know me as a teacher, they know my personality, they know my strengths, like they know when a kid is going to be a good fit to recommend them to me. So that really helps whether you are in that position or not. One thing that really can be great is like going to work with other directors. So like making yourself available to do master classes, to maybe come tune timpani. And I'm speaking in percussion terms here, but this could be like you could play any instrument and similarly come in and just be an assistant of sorts to other teachers in areas where they might be in need. So like come and teach a master class, tune an instrument, fix an instrument, be a resource, share resources, like all of these things can really, really help. But what can also help is just having like a quality public image. And this is as simple as like just making a nice thing that you send out. I really often get flyers in my email from other local private teachers in the area, and it just kind of looks like it's a Microsoft Word blank white page with like a picture of them that's taken on a phone and just kind of dragged and dropped into the middle, and then like just black and white text and maybe some kind of cheesy clip art. Like it's not entirely that professional. But if you get a really, really nice photographer, and for me, I hired a photographer to take some decent shots. You know, I found someone who was really affordable. I found actually a friend who gave me a discount. And like these photos are not even incredibly specific. Like they're not even actually me holding my instrument. They're just like high resolution, well exposed photos of my face from various different angles with different, the coloring is a little different on them. There's just like I got a handful of like options of things I was happy with representing me. Now, if you've seen my like Twitter or something, and yeah, I know like my photos are like a decade old now. I need to do some new ones, but having that and then just putting that like full screen on a Pages or a Word document, like as the background, rather than just like a little awkward square in the middle of it, like just having it, blowing it up so that the entire background is just a giant high resolution photo of yourself looking like a nice person with a good smile, like that can go a really, really long way. And then I have on mine like like a short paragraph blurb about my experience private teaching and as a performer, as a percussionist. And then I have like those little rippy things on the bottom with like my number and stuff like that. And what I did was when I first started really ramping up my private teaching, I took that to Staples and just printed out hundreds of them on like really, like it just costs a little bit extra just to get like a really high quality, nice glossy paper. And it just makes yours stand out way more amongst all the other things. And keep in mind, most people are just emailing their flyer. And I know we kind of live in an age, like you would think I'd be the last person to tell you to print out paper, but it really does help if you're just getting started to like go make lots of high quality paper flyers and then individually mail them to all the directors in the school district where you live or where you want to be teaching. And this really helped. And I don't do this every year. It's really time consuming, but I've also kind of got a little bit of momentum. It's not something that I have to do all the time in order to keep lots of students calling me. But it really did help when I was first starting out, especially when I really first started to teach privately in the district that I'm currently in now. All right, let's talk a little bit about, while we're on this topic of like your public representation, you need a website. There's lots of what you see is what you get style sites. There's things like Wix, Weebly, Squarespace. It has been my preference. I've been using them for almost 10 years now. I've found that Squarespace is like the cleanest and most intuitive. Squarespace is a little bit more of a premium price tag than some of its competitors, but the templates and just the overall styling and feel of the results you get, I feel like is of a higher quality than some of the competitors and with less steps, less fuss. So I take some of those high resolution photographs of myself and splatter them across my page. I'll link my own website in the notes to this episode. I don't think it's like the most shining perfect example of a website, but I try to make it very content forward, have pictures of myself in relevant places. I actually, on the sub page that is all about taking private lessons with me, I have like a giant kind of like a panoramic view of my studio, which shows all the gear and equipment in it. And I have actually on that same page pictures of all of my equipment, philosophy statement. I have videos of auditions that I have recorded for students. And then I actually have on my site linked a handbook for the public to view. And this is like more nuts and bolts of like how to park in my driveway, like how I do cancellations and makeups, pricing, like just any and everything that material needs, all of that stuff. And I actually make this handbook in Craft, which has been the focus now of 2 episodes of this show. I'll link those in the notes if you want to go grab it. But what I like about Craft is it allows me to use an application on my computer to really easily edit and update this handbook. And because it's just something that I interact with a lot on my computer, I don't want to be like logging into Squarespace every time I access it or make a minor tweak, fix a typo or something. So I make this in Craft and then I share it out to the web. To be honest, if you want to, Craft actually could make you a little mini website to represent yourself. Craft is, go back and listen to my Craft episode, but it is kind of like a hypercharged note-taking / personal knowledge management app, but it can publish any of your content to the web, so you can technically make a website on it. Now, I wanted to have more features and more customization over the look, so I'm happy with Squarespace, but my handbook is mostly just text. It's mostly just information, and like it's really kind of cumbersome to have a dense, informative document that lives on the web that I'm updating constantly in Squarespace or like one of these web apps. So I do that in Craft. You could easily do it. You could even just do it in like Evernote or any kind of like web-based note editing tool with really, really basic formatting, but where you can share a link publicly to the web. I also have on my site a password protected section that is just for students, and that has a Google Calendar that kind of shows them like all my lessons are in a sub calendar of my Google account called Lessons, and I publish that particular calendar to the web. This is pretty helpful because then, if someone's like, oh, do I have a lesson today? They can like go on there and check, see, and it's a direct reflection of like what all of my calendar apps on my phones and computers are telling me. So it's like to them like the most living document and the most recent representation of what I'm expecting to teach in my schedule that day. It also, like, some of them are pretty proactive. Some families, if they need to reschedule a lesson, they get that, like, if I'm teaching a giant block of lessons and then there's a hole in it, like that maybe that's a good time to do a lesson. So a lot of them will sometimes proactively say like, hey, it looks like maybe you're free Monday at 4. Can we do our lesson then? And that kind of helps speed up the efficiency of communication. I also have some resources that I share with kids on that site. some links out to, it's just kind of like a student resource center, like, frequent tools or like web URLs that I send students to. I just kind of house them all there so that students and families can have kind of a one-stop shop for things that I frequently tell them to access. Okay, let's talk about communication. Like at a certain point, people start writing to you and asking for lessons, and you get into these conversations, and this is where things get like the communication and scheduling piece is where I am like right on the border of having considered some more like professional business tools, but where I feel like it's just still a little bit less cumbersome to do it manually. And I've been introducing some time tracking into my life. I'm using the app Timery to track all the minutes per week that I communicate with my private students, and it's really not that many. I'd like to automate more of it, but so far I'm doing okay with just messaging and email. When I do start a new student, I have them fill out a Google form, basically just agreeing to all of the stuff that's in my handbook, just to make sure we're on the same page about that. And what this does is this form feeds a Google Sheet, which gets me their preferred contact information, amongst other things. And I just go ahead and when I agree to have a regular weekly lesson time with a family, then I will create a contact for them, and then I have a contacts group in the contacts app called, percussion lessons. And this is good because I do it once a month. I email everyone just to let them know if there are any days I need to cancel, or if there are any opportunities coming up, performances or auditions or honor groups, or just any other things I would want to tell them. And I would say in general that the issue that I have, like messaging and email, it's tricky because like I do develop a personal relationship with these families, so I feel less, I guess, like, in the same way that I'm always cautious to start like a text messaging relationship with a colleague in the school system, because I never know like if that's their style or not, or if that's like invasive on their personal time, or on their like, I never know that information. So like most people in the professional world will like default to email. It's always a safe bet. But the truth is, like for me, I know that I can just answer a text message much faster. So like a lot of my families, I prefer texting for things like rescheduling and communicating. The main benefit of email is that it is easier to organize email. So like I can mark it unread or archive it. Actually, if you're using iOS and macOS this coming fall, you're going to be able to finally mark a text message as unread. It's going to change my life. I'm going to try to have everybody message me from now on. The benefit of email, of course, though, is I can send group messages. And I have actually some email templates that I've managed in an app called TextExpander. And TextExpander is an app I have talked about on here before. You customize a snippet of text, and then you customize a larger body of text that it expands into. So, for example, an email reminding someone to pay for lessons in the month. This is one way I've handled this problem. We'll talk about some other ways later. But one way that you can do this is to have like a pre-built text expander message that says like, "Hi, I have not received payment for month X, Y, and or Z. Please send it at your convenience." And I can have all that entire like pre-built email, just, I can just type in like late payment into the body of an email message, and TextExpander, working in the background, will automatically insert that text into the body of the email. Now, of course, because X, Y, and Z are variables, it'll actually ask me first which month are you collecting money from, and give me a choice, and then it'll automatically write the email using the month that I'm requesting instead. And I have all sorts of these things. I have pre-built messages telling people who are beginning students what equipment to buy, all sorts of pre-built messages that I like to send. Speaking of this, so this kind of connects a little bit into scheduling and automation of scheduling. I am using an app on all of my devices called Fantastical, and it is a free app. The feature I'm about to describe, though, is actually like a paid subscription thing. You might have used Calendly before. Calendly is a great service where you can have it look inside of your calendars and then say basically like, hey, okay, like here's a window of time. Look and see when I have no calendar events inside of that window of time, and then offer all of my available times to a person, and then they can sort of go into a little website and like choose their favorite options, and then Calendly will like take whatever option they chose and like put it right in that calendar. So I was using this for a while to schedule makeups, but Calendly, I wanted it to be really, really specific to my needs, and they ask you to pay for certain premium features, whereas Fantastical I was already paying for because I just really like it as a calendar app. Well, Fantastical has this feature now. So if you're on Mac or iOS, you can basically go into the settings of their app and it'll actually bounce you out to a web browser where you can set up some parameters. I'll describe mine for templates of scheduling makeup lessons because it's a good way to kind of describe how it works. So let's say that I have a 30-minute lesson. I actually, for the record, teach 30, 45, and 60-minute lessons. So Fantastical has a template for each one of these possible lesson durations. And then what the template does, let's say that we're talking here about the 30-minute lesson, is I've told Fantastical to use my lesson calendar, my lesson Google Calendar, and look only on nights that I want to teach lessons. Look only where there are no other events in any of my calendars. So let's just say that's like a night I typically teach lessons, but I've got an errand in my personal calendar on that same night. It will not show that as available to the student. Well, then what it'll do is it'll take all the free time, kind of like what I just explained with Calendly. It'll offer all of the free times that it can possibly fit a 30-minute lesson into any of those little cracks, and it'll send that to my student. They'll choose their favorites, and then it'll actually just add it right back to the app. And what's cool is I don't have to use a third-party website because this is all happening inside of my calendar app. It just shows me a notification on my phone. This person has scheduled this lesson length on this date. I can accept or deny their choice right from within the calendar app, and it's really great. And Fantastical does this by providing me with a URL for each of these templates, and I can never remember these URLs because they're like just a long string of characters. So I have in TextExpander created a snippet called 30-minute lesson makeup. And if I just type that into a text message, it'll transform those words into the URL for the 30-minute lesson makeup. And then it'll go straight to the student who's trying to schedule the makeup. So they tend to love that. And this is, like I said earlier in the episode, there are some tools, some professional tools. I know Acuity is now owned by Squarespace. And so if I ever really wanted to go even further with the customization and the automation, Acuity is a great service for scheduling this kind of stuff. It's a little bit more geared towards businesses, and it gives me the feeling that some of the parameters and the customizations make me feel more like it's better suited towards a kind of a single irregular service, kind of like a massage appointment or a medical appointment or a single freestanding lesson rather than the more weekly reoccurring thing. This is why I still kind of manually do a little bit of my scheduling, is because there is a human element to scheduling, and you have to work with families to kind of see what's going to be the best fit for their schedule and to make sure, hey, this is a weekly and regular thing. Leaving all of that, 100% of that to the computer is not something I'm comfortable with yet, but this Fantastical feature really does get a lot of that heavy automation, that kind of fuss of me digging around my calendar and problem solving. It just kind of turns that into a single sharing of a link, which is great. Hey, speaking of Craft, let's come back to Craft because every one of my students has a document that I've created in Craft, and I have shared the URL to that document with them and their family. And what I do is inside of that document is every week we have a lesson, I create a card, and that card is just titled whatever the date is, and then it has a list of all the things we worked on so that they can easily go back and see all a history of all the things we've worked on in one place on the web. And what's great about this, I used to actually just write notes for them in the notes field of the calendar event. So they would go to my Google Calendar on my password protected site, and if they hovered their mouse over the lesson they just had in the calendar, it would show the notes. But that was getting to be really limited for a number of reasons. First of all, I can make the Craft thing look way better. It can have headings and bold and italics and color. It can have images, but I can also drag files into it. So if I have a student who is needs a resource, a copy of some sheet music, an excerpt of something, a measure of something they need to work on, or an exercise I have somewhere on my computer, or even just a play along recording. Here's a play along track that I've made for you to practice your swing drum set pattern on. I can just drag and drop those file resources into the note for that week. And it's great because now it's all in one place. They just have a secret URL that only they know. And once they click on it the first time, they can bookmark it on their browser if they like, and then we're off. It's great. It just has added a lot of clarity to the expectations that I have for them. And it's really helpful for me because, if I have let's say I have a lot of fifth grade students, which I do right now, and a lot of them started with me around the same time and are in roughly similar parts of some of the same method books. So it's really helpful for me to remember exactly, not even just exactly what page I assigned them and what exercises, but also what was the feedback I gave them, because I put that in the note too. So like, hey, we said we were going to work on this at 80 beats per minute this week with 0 hesitations. Like that's a real quick and easy thing I can write in the craft note. And then the next week I can say like, okay, here we go, 80. I can turn on my metronome and we can be off. Speaking of the metronome and play-alongs, there's all sorts of audio supplemental play-along stuff that I use in my lessons. In fact, I'm reading here, and the first one I want to talk about is Adagio. I'm often referring to a lot of orchestral and like chamber music and solo music when I'm in my lessons, and Adagio is like it's like a classical music streaming service. But what Adagio does is, it does have some exclusive recordings, but it's not really like a different database than Spotify or Apple Music. But what it is they've built an entire metadata structure around searching and filtering the results. So you can go into Adagio and say like the other day, I had a student who was working on a snare drum excerpt from Scheherazade. And we were just kind of talking about like some of the stylistic challenges and technical challenges of this piece. And I was like, let's just listen to like as many recordings of this snare drum excerpt as we can. And so I went into Adagio, the Mac version of it, and I just searched for the piece. And the piece is its own entry. So unlike something like Spotify, where like the piece might be like kind of broken down, like movement by movement, track by track, Scheherazade is itself an entity inside of Adagio, which I can search. And then I can filter it by lots of things, because in the way that like Spotify might just be like artist, album, song title, well, Adagio is aware of composer, performer, ensemble, conductor, soloist, year, like all of these different parameters, this different metadata that is like nearly impossible for something like iTunes or Apple Music to depict meaningfully. So actually, it's funny I'm talking about that problem because Apple has purchased a competing app to Adagio called PrimePhonic and is heavily rumored to be making, in fact, they're not rumored, they're working on a competing app, which who knows if it'll be like an additional paid thing. I'm an Apple Music subscriber, so I'm curious to see if my Apple Music payment covers this new classical thing coming from Apple or not. But for now, I'm happy to pay Adagio a handful of dollars a month to get this tool. So anyway, I'm doing my Scheherazade search, and I can say like, okay, let's just hear only the ones that are played by New York and Boston and Cleveland and Berlin, and let's just hear only these 7 conductors. And let's hear one from this year, this year, and this year. You can filter these results, and then within seconds, we're just like back to back listening to all these wide-ranging different interpretations of how to play this snare drum piece, which is really cool. YouTube is obviously a resource I use a lot. Sometimes, speaking of my Apple Music woes, sometimes Apple Music is like kind of slow and terrible, so sometimes it's actually faster to find a song that I might even have in my library by YouTube searching it instead. I love to use the slowdown features of YouTube, but sometimes they're not granular enough for the needs if I'm like trying to have someone do something really slowly. Let's say the other day I was having a student play some excerpts out of a book called Future Sounds, and this is a drum set method book by the drummer of Tower of Power, Dave Garibaldi, and we were, jamming on these different beats, these different exercises, by me blasting the song What Is Hip through my studio speakers. But we were going at like 50% speed. Well, once the student was kind of comfortable at that speed, 50 to 75% is quite a jump when you're learning a new technical skill. So I have a couple of things that I can do at this point. One great app I use is called Downie, which allows me to download an audio or a video file from a website that I'm looking at and then save it as a video or an MP3 to my computer's hard drive. And that's a really useful tool for grabbing all sorts of things that are used for educational and fair use related purposes in my home studio. There's a couple of layers of work removed from that recently, though, because I've been using some extensions in my web browser that are actually able to do this without even downloading. Now, after I download it, I'll bring it into an app called AnyTune. I have a couple of alternatives I like to this, which I'll throw in the show notes to this episode, but AnyTune is a cross-platform application that allows you to slow down, speed up, or change the pitch of an audio file independently of one another. So I can take, let's say I just stripped What Is Hip from the web. Well, now I can bring it into AnyTune and slow it down 99% speed or 76% speed. Or if we're practicing jazz vibraphone and we want to practice in a different key, I can raise it up 3 half steps. All of that happens independently. Now, aside from these kinds of like transcribing apps like AnyTune, there's a lot of browser extensions which will also do this with the content you're looking at. So I don't even recently even need to do the downloading step. I can just use a browser extension. And there's one that I really like in Safari that I've been using, and this extension is called Vidimote. And what it does is, let's say you're looking at a video or an audio file on a website, you click this extension and it is more or less kind of overlays a similar interface to what AnyTune does. So kind of like a little slider to speed up or slow down the tempo or to raise or lower the pitch. So kind of cool. It just does it straight in the web browser. There's a couple ones for Chrome that do this as well. I know a lot of you probably use Chrome, so I'll put links to all of those kinds of apps in the show notes to this episode as well. Of course, I do love metronome apps. Tonal Energy Tuner is my preferred one. I use it for teaching intonation in the band environment. I've got a whole episode about it, which I will also link in the show notes. But it's also got a great metronome, and the metronome is cool because it can actually count out loud, 1, 2, 3, 4. And of all the apps that do that particular thing, it has, I think, the most natural sounding counting voice. But it can also create a sequence. So like in percussion, I'll often have a snare drum solo that maybe has like alternating time signatures and lots of very, very technical tempo changes. Well, you can tell Tonal Energy, hey, do like 4 measures of 4/4 at 83 beats per minute, and then do like a measure of 3/8, and then do 2 measures of 6/8, and then do a measure of 4/4 at this tempo. And you can just create an entire sequence, which can then be practiced along to in the lesson or exported as an audio file, which can then be dragged into the craft document for the student to practice with. In fact, a lot of these slow down, speed up resources I make and a lot of these YouTube links and references get dragged and dropped into my students' craft notes. It's a real big difference than when I was growing up. My private teacher, when he wanted me to listen to Tower of Power, would like give me a cassette tape, and then I would like take it, and then he just didn't have it while I had it. And then that was that. So we're living in a very richly resourced kind of age of the internet here. I do heavily depend on the forScore app. My entire method book library is digitized in PDF form and is indexed in the forScore app, which syncs over iCloud between my Mac, my iPad, and my phone. I've got some blog posts about forScore, which I will also link if you want to read more about that. I've even got a video, probably one of my most popular YouTube videos I've ever published, is about creating an index, which is to say, like, if you have real books, which I use very frequently in my lessons, or if you have a book that's like got a lot of single entries in it, so like a PDF that you've scanned of a method book with like 260 etudes in it that are just like a couple of lines long each. Well, you can attach a CSV file, like a directory file, to a score in forScore, which will link the titles of the excerpts to the page numbers in the PDF that they're on. So that when you're searching forScore, let's just say a student of mine is going to play Autumn Leaves for me. They're going to improvise it, and I want to pull up a reference of the chart on the forScore app. But when I search the words Autumn Leaves, even though the PDF file is just called Real Book, and it's just a PDF of all the songs in the Real Book, I can actually drill down specifically to that song because I have indexed that book. And I've done this with a number of the method books that I use most regularly. In fact, you don't even need to do the CSV thing. Like sometimes if I'm opening a specific page in forScore and I'm realizing to myself, like, hey, you know what? I go to this page a lot. I can just bookmark it straight from within the forScore app. For example, the other day, I was working with a student on holding 4 mallets, and I realized, I'm like, what? I tell my students very often when I'm first teaching them 4 mallets, hey, turn to page 200 or whatever it is in the book that I have them get. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go to this page in the method book on my iPad and then create a bookmark called 4 Mallets Introduction. And now I can really easily search and drill straight down into that page at any time. Another cool and fun tool I use is Ableton. This is a little bit out there, but I'm going to say it. Why not? Sometimes I find myself where I really need to kind of coach a student through how to practice something, and they need to feel what it's like to truly treat a piece of music like a project, where they break it apart into its smallest possible component parts and repeat something with enough regularity that they can no longer do it wrong. This is the kind of thing where, yes, they do need to learn how to do this in their own home practice by themselves, and they regulate it. But that doesn't mean it can't be fun in the lesson. So sometimes what I'll do is, with the power of the Ableton push, I'll open up an Ableton push project, and I'll sort of like jam improvise, like dance music along with them. So rather than just like the 4 clicks per per measure of the metronome, what's happening instead is like they'll hear a dance beat, And then without the dance beat ever stopping, because the Ableton push is able to work with Ableton, because it attaches everything to the grid that I do, I can kind of open up a new software instrument and add a bass and kind of jam with that, and then add a synthesizer or a piano or something fun. And then when, if they've repeated something like 20 times, what they're feeling is like they're playing something enough times to be successful, but it actually kind of feels to them like they're part of a developing song, because I'm like adding layers to this groove as they repeat the same thing over and over and over again. Hopefully I'm explaining this okay. And then what I can do is like when they're like maybe 10, 20 times of success in a row, I can like just by turning the knob for the tempo on the Ableton push, I can slightly increase the speed, and now they're doing it a little faster. Maybe you can add a few more layers and then go a little faster. And I can sort of create this environment where I'm kind of like they're practicing to dance music instead of a metronome, which is way more cool and fun. But I'm also sort of like improvising that as I go. And I've had students tell me before, like, hey, that was actually really fun. I've never had more fun playing the same 5 notes, 40 times in a row. And I'm like, hey, cool. Let me bounce that track I just made and then drag it into your craft document so that you can always practice that tricky spot with a dance groove going on. So that's kind of just a little bit of an extra, but a fun way to create music. You certainly don't need the Ableton push to do it, but it's cool. I like it because it doesn't really require me to like stare at my computer screen or like poke around in Ableton's interface. It's more like playing an instrument, only the instrument is Ableton Live. So I do interact with a lot of resources. Sometimes I have to gather emails, websites, documents. I have to kind of keep things together in context. An example of this recently is a lot of my students auditioned for some of our local area youth orchestras. And there's a couple of those. And I'll just use the Baltimore Youth Symphony Orchestra as one that I had a handful of students audition for. So I'll use them as an example. Helping a student prepare for an audition when they've never done it can be a lot. There's different parts of the website that they have to read. They have to make sure they're paying attention to like really meticulous details of how, like what excerpts to prepare, what prepared solo music to prepare, like how in the age of video submitted auditions, they have to know like how do they want it to be recorded? Does it need to be done in one take? What kind of like, do you say your name at the beginning? Like what, all these like kind of like formatting related concerns. And this is not even to mention like the many detailed musical requirements of the audition itself. So sometimes I'm finding that I'm looking through these resources, and it's just really helpful to have a place on my computer where I can store some email correspondences with a local youth orchestra alongside some different pages of their website that contain audition information. Maybe I also want to like go and find the excerpts myself in my own resources and then have those resources be related. Like for example, I have a digital copy of John Tafoya's excellent book, The Working Timpanist Survival Guide, which has like detailed analysis of some of the timpani excerpts that my students often prepare. And so like I'll take a couple pages of his book, and then I want to like be able to see those like right in the same place that I'm seeing the actual website with the audition requirements. So what I'll do is I'm using an app called DEVONthink for this, but you could easily use any note-taking app. Evernote is a great one for this. In any kind of like note environment where that's able to take any kind of file format you throw at it. So the reason I like Evernote, the reason I like DEVONthink is that you can create a group or a folder or a collection of different materials that are not just files. Like we're not just talking about like Word documents. We're talking you can mix emails with websites, with PDFs, with text notes, with MP3s. Like you can just sort of create a group of related information from various places and kind of organize it all together. And this is really helpful when my students are auditioning because let's just use the example of the Baltimore Youth Symphony Orchestra. Every time I have a student walk into my studio who's preparing that audition, I can just go to that group and have really instant access to all of the necessary resources they would ever need to access, to know stuff, to have knowledge about that audition, which has been super helpful. Okay, let's talk about home automation. I am teaching out of my home studio, but this is relevant even if you have your own separate location. I'm just down here sometimes teaching back to back over and over and over again, and it saves me a little bit of time and energy if I can let my students in and out of my studio without walking up and down a flight of stairs. So I do have an automated doorbell and lock. I have kind of like a side door that is able to go through our laundry room and straight down to the teaching studio. It's a little bit separated from the rest of our home. And when a student comes to the door, I have my iPad usually positioned on my desk with the Apple Home app. And yeah, I mean, when they ring the doorbell, it goes full screen with an image of that, a live image of them standing there. And then it presents me a button where I can, in one tap, choose to unlock the lock, which is also connected. If you are interested, let's see, I am using currently a Nest doorbell and Schlag lock on that door. I actually, though, recommend different brands than what I have. If you want to get something that's a little bit more integrated into Apple Home, I certainly recommend the Logitech Circle doorbell. If that doesn't matter to you, I would probably say that the Google Nest is probably the best one. The only reason I'm hesitant to recommend it is because it does not directly integrate with Apple Home, which is what I use for home automation. I had to buy a third-party product called the Starling IO, which basically tricks the Apple Home app into showing all of my Nest devices as if they are compatible with HomeKit, which is honestly a miracle that that little device exists, but simultaneously annoying. So if you want fully integrated stuff, like anytime I recommend home automation, I typically recommend people try to find products that are able to work with the widest variety of platforms. So I typically only buy something if it'll work with Apple, Amazon, and Google. And sometimes that is not an option, or sometimes some other home or technology priority requires that I cannot get a product that's equally compatible, and then I end up buying crazy things like this little Starling IO hub. So anyway, by the way, I'll link all this stuff in the notes to this episode. It's pretty cool too, is using the Shortcuts app, I can create automations that tell me things about my home. So for example, I have a button on my Stream Deck, which is in my On My Desk blog post mentioned earlier. And all this button does is it runs a shortcut that looks at the status of my studio door and tells me, is it opened or not? Some of my students don't close it enough. And if the sensor does not detect that it's all the way closed, then it'll tell me without getting up from my desk. I've got other Stream Deck buttons for locking and unlocking the door. So while, yes, I can do it from an iOS device, as previously mentioned, I can also do it straight from this device, which is always on and always available for a button press. I also have a shortcut that I run whenever I start teaching. If I'm going to teach a handful of lessons in a row, I have a shortcut called Private Teaching, and that puts all of my devices in a special focus mode. Focus modes I've been covering a lot here lately, and focus modes is it's an Apple-only type of feature, but basically you can customize your own Do Not Disturb. And my lesson focus mode has only the students who I teach. Only my contacts list of those students are able to notify my phone and my wife. So basically it just ensures that while I'm down here private teaching, I'm not getting like all sorts of distractions like work-related stuff or like messages from friends or any of those kinds of things. Because I am a huge nerd and I'm running the beta of iOS 16, which is coming out later this fall, on my phone, there's actually this cool new thing where you can customize a lock screen and pair it to a focus mode. So like I have a special lock screen that is specific to when I am in lesson. I run my lesson shortcut and it puts all my devices into this private teaching focus mode. And then my phone lock screen shows me the status of my door and what my next student's name is and like what time their lesson is. And then you can even set a specific page of your home screen app icons to show up when you're in a focus mode. So when I'm in lesson focus mode, only one screen of my iPhone will show up as available to me, and it's just a giant calendar widget with my schedule for the night, and then app icons for the Tonal Energy Tuner app, my shortcuts for checking my door status, locking and unlocking the door, quick link to my Apple Home app for viewing the cameras, and then the forScore app on my iPhone. Because every now and then it's just easy to I want to have reference to a score and pace around my room. While my students are playing for me, I can, easily do that while holding my phone in my hands. As I was talking about earlier, there are some more like business-oriented professional options for some of these things. If you want to be a little bit more, I don't want to just describe this as more professional, but let's just be honest. Like there's definitely like a feeling that comes with getting a formatted, thoroughly designed invoice that does not come with an email requesting money. So like if you wanted to get more serious about collecting money, you could do something like QuickBooks, which is an Intuit product. Acuity, like I mentioned earlier, is great for scheduling. It will also handle payment. What has not stuck for me is that it's handling the payment on sort of a per lesson or a per appointment basis, where I prefer to collect monthly. So again, like you have to add these layers as needed. There's also like web apps and phone and mobile apps that are like entirely designed around the concept of private teaching, and that will manage everything from your scheduling to your finances to the lesson notes. So like things that will kind of be a one-stop shop rather than all of these different disparate apps that you're sort of interconnecting together, which, as you can probably tell from this episode, that's kind of what I'm doing. And the reason for this is because a lot of these apps work better than these websites. And when something will not work in the way I want it to, I can more easily customize it to, or use an app that does do the thing that I want it to, and then bring that into the workflow through something like Shortcuts or something like this. And this is why, for me, having kind of the Shortcuts app be like this automation platform on my devices allows me to use apps that support shortcuts like Fantastical, Craft, and so on. It allows me to kind of string together my own system, which works a little bit better for me. Now, if you're comfortable with one company controlling the entire experience of all of your lessons, like from the calendar to the finance to the communication to the notes, that's great. I mean, there's all sorts of benefits that you can get from that. For example, like some of these services will automatically remind your students with a text or an email the day of their lesson. So like, if you, for some reason, need to reschedule a lesson, you can delete it off your calendar, and then, it'll automatically take care of the communication for you. That's really great. But then they don't as easily integrate with your personal calendar. So like for me, I was looking at some of these apps, and the way that a lot of them work is you can only do stuff from their website. It's not like a two-way conversation where I can like go into my calendar, drag and drop an event around, and then have it be reflected. It's more like you do the calendaring, the scheduling, and the payment through the app, and then it tells your calendar what that looks like. So I don't know. For me, that's not the way I want to work. I know one of the more popular ones amongst some of my colleagues in the area is called My Music Staff. Again, it's just a little much for me, but might be worth you checking out. I'll link a couple of these options in the show notes to this episode. Now, I know I left out a lot of stuff. I mean, I'm just looking around my studio here and thinking like, I have a tripod for recording students on my phone and playing themselves back to themselves in slow motion using the slow motion camera. I've got some recording gear for recording auditions into schools and local youth ensembles. I've got some other stuff I'm just seeing around here, but I think the bottom line is this. I just covered the essentials, and would love to know if there's more that you want me to cover, but I think that this is plenty for now on getting started with some very, very cool tools. I did want to just real quick do some segmented stuff. I want to do an app of the week, a tech tip of the week, and a music selection of the week. And the app of the week I mentioned real quick in passing earlier. It's called Timery, and Timery is a time tracking app. Now, if you've ever tried to use a time tracking app before, you'll know that the hardest thing to remember is to start and stop your timers, which gives you bad data, which means that the experience is not meaningful, which is discouraging, which then makes you not want to use the app, which then means you have even less data, and this cycle continues until you eventually just might give up. This is what's happened to me anyway over the last couple of apps I've tried. But Timery works with a program or a service called Toggle. And in the same way that you can use like the Microsoft Outlook app to access your Gmail, well, Timery is like a client, like an email client, but for the Toggle timing service. So Toggle is, you have to have an account with them, but then Timery is the app I use. It runs on the Mac and on iOS devices and on the Apple Watch. And the developer of this app just keeps iterating on it to take away all those little friction points of starting and stopping timers, all the way to the point where now I can have like a permanently visible depiction of which of my timers is currently running on my watch. And I can have like a permanently floating window on my Mac that floats above all my other windows so that no matter what I'm doing, I can always see the currently running timer and not forget to change it if I switch contexts. Time tracking is not for everyone, but for me, one of the things that's helped me to know how many private students I can manage has been to get a really honest understanding of how much time I spend doing a lot of these little logistics that I talked about today. Things like communication and planning and prep and all of that. So Timery and the Toggle service get my vote for app of the week. My tech tip of the week could not be more basic. If you have never held down the command key on a Mac and hit the spacebar at the same time, I ask you to do this. I know this has been a tech tip before on this show, but there's got to be a few of you listening who have never done this. It opens up the spotlight and allows you to search all the contents of your computer. If you've been using this for years and you want to take it to the next level, like maybe you really enjoy these automation apps I've mentioned today, like shortcuts. There's a really cool app I like called Alfred, which is similar to the Spotlight, but it like adds a bunch of other features as well, and gives you like high degrees of customization over how it behaves. In addition to having a community of people developing plugins and workflows that you can install straight into the app to add features to it. So I really like it a lot. They just released their version 5, and using command space, I've actually remapped command space to the Alfred app. I use it so often these days. Music of the week, it's got to be Beyonce, Renaissance. Wow, what a great record. I don't even know what to say. It's just so danceable, and I love it. I love every second of it. It's just been on nonstop since it released. So you probably don't live under a rock and have been listening to it, but in case you haven't been, do that, definitely. Okay, well, thanks for listening. Please write to me if you want to know other things about my private teaching workflow. This has been fun. Have an awesome week. See you next time. Today, I would like to introduce you to my scale exercise play-along tracks with trap beats, available for sale at robbyburns.com. These trap beat play-alongs include over 72 audio recordings, each of which includes a count-off, a trap beat at 70 beats per minute, and a tuning drone playing both the tonic and each note of the scale in just intonation, so your ensemble can learn to play and tune, develop steady, sustained tone, and blend with other sounds. These drones are stacked over top engaging trap beats that help students to practice at slower tempos while developing steadiness of time and a better concept of how the beat is subdivided. The scale exercises include whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, scale and thirds, and a mini scale with an arpeggio at the end in all 12 keys. I've also included 3 speed variations of a Remington exercise, so band ensembles can work on their favorite tone and technical exercises, whether they be from a method book or of your own invention. The tracks are $15, but for $40, you can get the stems to the tracks in Logic Pro and GarageBand format, so that you can do things like speed them up and slow them down, change the pitch, add your own accompaniment, take out my voice and add your own,
and 2 and 3 and go,
or even sequence the tracks together to completely automate your ensemble warm-up. These tracks are perfect for running through your Google Meet, Zoom, or virtual teaching platform of choice, or for running through the loudspeakers at the beginning of your in-person rehearsal. Check them out now at robbyburns.com/store. I'm Robby Burns. Thanks for listening to Music Ed Tech Talk. You can find the show's page, show notes for the episode, and my blog at musicedtechtalk.com. You can subscribe to blog posts through an RSS app of your choice, and you can subscribe to the podcast in the podcast app of your choice. You can now get blog posts delivered right into your email inbox once a week. Please rate and review this show in the podcast app. It absolutely helps. It'll take a second and just a few taps. Word of mouth is helpful too, so please spread the word about it. Learn more about my music and teaching career at robbyburns.com. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube at Robby Burns. Please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/musicedtechtalk. All support tiers get perks, but even the base tier gets you a monthly video update with an app and music recommendation and some tech tips. Of course, also access to the Music Ed Tech Talk Discord community, where you can chat with other supporters and guests of the show about music, apps, pedagogy, lesson ideas, tech support, and more. It's a fun place to be, and I hope to connect with you soon. Thanks to this week's sponsor, Scale Exercise Play Along Tracks. Be sure to check it out, and see you next time.